This is the Global Efforts to Accelerate Neonatal Drug Development Topic Symposia. And I'm Chris Gleason, and I'm co-chairing, actually moderating more than I'm not speaking, this wonderful gathering. And we have 6 speakers. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's my co-chair as well, Jonathan Davis, who hopefully many of you know. John is chief of the Division of Newborn Medicine and professor of pediatrics at the Floating Hospital for Children, Tufts, in Boston. He's vice chair of pediatrics and chair of the Child Oversight Committee at NIH and the Neonatal Advisory Committee in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics at the FDA. He is one of the co-chairs of the new International Neonatal Consortium, which he'll talk to you some about. So, John, it's a pleasure.
And welcome, everyone. We're delighted you're here. And we're going to talk a lot about a unique time in the history of neonatology. There is a tremendous amount of emphasis in the press, in Congress, and in the public, and in science on what we're doing in neonatology. It's long overdue, but it is our time right now, and so we'll talk more about that. And I have no conflicts to declare. So with newborn intensive care, certainly people in this group know well that 6% of the 4 million births each year in the United States require admission to a newborn intensive care unit. And for instance, in the United States, we have prematurity rates that are the worst of any developed country in the world. The total cost of prematurity in the US is over $29 billion each year. And despite a tremendous amount of science, newborn intensive care, an enormous amount of money spent, there have been small improvements in survival and outcome in the last 20 years. So there is still a significant number of infants who are surviving, and they're surviving with significant complications. Most importantly, over 90% of the drugs that are used in the NICU are not FDA approved for the use that we're using them. The last approved drug that was found to significantly improve survival and outcome in premature infants was surfactant in 1991, which was 25 years ago. Clearly, something has to change. Well, our colleagues in Congress and our colleagues in Europe with European legislation have really worked very hard and passed a number of legislative efforts to try to stimulate drug development in pediatrics. It's a small market, it is high risk, and there aren't a lot of financial benefits for companies to get into that space. And so this really just summarizes all the different legislation that has occurred. Most importantly, despite that, there has not been the kind of improvement that we would like, especially in neonatology. What's most important, you can see all the way on the right with that red star, is the passage of FDASIA, which is the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, which makes the Pediatric Research Equity Act and the Best Pharmaceutical for Children Act in the US permanent. It is the carrot and the stick to try to require more neonatal drug development, and it has been effective to a certain extent, and we'll talk more about that. So there's been tremendous emphasis on more pediatric studies and more pediatric drug development for children, which is a really good thing. It's keeping the regulatory agencies quite busy. But when you really look at it and drill down, and this is a paper from JAMA Pediatrics in 2014, if you look at the 406 medicines that were studied in the pediatric population in order to get an extra 6 months of patent protection and what we call exclusivity, only 28 of them, 7%, were studied in neonates. And out of those 28 drugs, we didn't use almost any of them. So these were just drugs that were studied to get extra patent protection in neonates, but they really aren't drugs that we use on a routine basis. So clearly, neonates, as Bob Ward has called them, therapeutic orphans, and there's a lot more attention on how we can make a difference and an impact on this population. So we have a dream, and that started, you're going to hear more about the International Neonatal Consortium that we've developed. So our dream is that every newborn admitted to the NICU will enroll in a study protocol to optimize outcomes similar to cancer. And we're on our way to do that at Tufts. We have a lot of studies going on. The definitions for our most important outcomes will be the same worldwide. Why is BPD called something in one place and called something different somewhere else? We're going to collect standardized data on all infants, and the databases will be shared, harmonized, and readily searchable. We'll be able to easily examine survival and outcome worldwide and adopt best practices and share those best practices with all of us so that we're all doing the same thing. We'll have established normal laboratory values based on birth weight, gestational age, and postnatal age. And so this is what we dream about. We dream that all drugs in the NICU will be approved for use in our population by the regulatory agencies. And what does that mean? It means that there's sufficient safety and efficacy data that exists to allow it to become approved. Drug formulations will be designed for neonates, and any additives or excipients will be safe and not affect efficacy. Regulators, investigators, funding agencies, industry and parents groups, we're all going to collaborate to develop the best master protocols with agents that are regulatory ready to get to these regulatory agencies to be approved. And high quality and ethical trials conducted in multiple countries simultaneously with well-qualified investigators and sustainable infrastructure. And what we really want is novel therapeutics for neonates that we can do faster, cheaper, and better. So that led to the formation of the International Neonatal Consortium. This was helped pushed along by the Food and Drug Administration with a grant to the Critical Path Institute, and you're going to hear a lot more about that this afternoon. So we really have them to thank. We thank our European colleagues and other colleagues throughout the world and their regulatory agencies who have bought into this. So the International Neonatal Consortium has been developed in order to concentrate its efforts on those conditions most commonly encountered in the NICU and on the prevention of preterm birth. So you can see the conditions on the right that we have started with to examine in more detail. And this talks to you about how this consortium has come together. So you see the regulatory agencies along here, the FDA, the European Medicine Agency, the Japanese authorities. You see the NIH that's participating. We have representation from neonatal nurses in the academic community, the pharmaceutical companies and industry, and it's all being catalyzed by the Critical Path Institute that is really providing infrastructure that we need to make this work. And you can see all the companies here on the right that are members of this consortium and are helping to provide funding. You can see the nursing organizations and the families and advocacy groups that are engaged with us as well. Accomplishments, you're going to hear a lot more about that. We had initial meetings at the FDA and EMA to launch the consortium. High priority working groups with seizures, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, clinical pharmacology, and big data. We have active involvement and participation by many highly motivated and qualified people from around the globe. Many are here today. We've already, in the first year or two of this, we've had multiple impactful publications that you'll hear more about. We've developed a clinical pharmacology white paper to help inform regulators on the conduct of clinical trials in neonates, and there's been tremendous support by the Critical Path Institute. We are involved in more now with retinopathy of prematurity, infections, hemodynamics, and neonatal absence syndrome, and we're leveraging the efforts of these initiatives and have now expanded to all of pediatrics to form the Pediatrics Trial Consortium. And I'll just very briefly talk to you about it. Ultimately, what we're doing is with this consortium, there's an advice and guidance organization with strategic planning, leadership, operation plans are being formed, financial projections. So ultimately, what our goal is to develop a global pharmaceutical company, a nonprofit that will only do trials in children. So it's in the process of getting tax-exempt status and a variety of legal papers to be incorporated. And then off it goes into a nonprofit. We're in the process of hiring the CEO, the chief financial officer, and the leadership. We're refining strategic and operational plans, recalculating financial projections, and completing legal assessments. This process is moving very quickly. We're building an administrative core and beginning operations, and hopefully we'll start moving ahead in this process. So this just shows you exactly what's happening now with strategy and planning, capability, tools, education and best practices, and infrastructure and trial execution. That is all moving ahead really very quickly. So I end my brief comments with this slide. We're on our way to the Emerald City. We now have the opportunity to go see the Wizard of Oz, where we haven't in the past. And we really have a lot of thanks for the regulatory agencies to be much more open and engaging and speaking with us on how this process should occur. So we need to have sustainable infrastructure. You can't start a trial, run it, and then break everything down and come back and start it all over again. That's a waste of time and money. We need sustainable infrastructure. We need cooperative groups, so all of us cooperating together. And our meetings involve regulators, administrators, academic people, everyone, all in the same room. We need well-trained and knowledgeable investigators to help us run these trials. And we really need efficient regulatory practices. And that's really what the International Neonatal Consortium represents. So I think I'll stop there and move on with the rest of the program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Mark Turner. Mark is a senior lecturer in neonatology at the University of Liverpool in the UK, and on the Faculty of Health and Life Science in the Institute for Translational Medicine there. He has more letters after his name than I've seen on just about anybody's CV, and it's very impressive. He has a PhD in placental physiology, but has turned his attention for the last decade to drug development in neonates and children. He's the Director of Research and Development at the Liverpool Women's NHS Foundation Trust and Associate Director of NIHR Medicines for Children's Research Network. And he co-chairs the International Neonatal Consortium. So Mark, it's a privilege to have you here and sharing your excellent talk with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, for your kind words, and thank you to John and to the societies for the opportunity to contribute to this exciting session. So we want to improve outcomes for neonates, and focusing on medicines, there are two ways to do this. First of all, we can study existing medicines, and people usually do this to look at the dose, indications, and to compare them to other medicines to work out which one is the best. We need to add to that the study of innovative medicines. And here we have the opportunity to study the formulation, the dose, the indication, and the benefit-risk balance. And this then leads to a license, a label, or a marketing authorization. And I'd like to suggest that rigorous clinical trials feed in most clearly to the license, label, or marketing authorization. But personally, I'm not sure that rigorous clinical trials have been done in the past for studying existing medicines. And maybe we just need to think about what we mean by rigorous clinical trials in this context. If you ask most practicing neonatologists, then they'll cite the principles of good clinical practice and evidence-based medicine for a rigorous trial. They'll want a trial that can recruit to the desired number of people with good outcome measures. And of course, we want to put the family at the center of trial design and implementation. We want to make sure it works, so it's good feasibility and it's well powered. And that's what most people would see as a rigorous clinical trial in my experience. And what has that given us? Well, here's one example relating to inhaled nitric oxide for preterm infants from a seminal editorial a few years ago. Can the clinician, with data available from 6 large-scale clinical trials, make an evidence-based decision about the use of inhaled nitric oxide to improve survival without bronchopulmonary dysplasia? And at that stage, the answer was no. Although inhaled nitric oxide might be promising, work is needed on the optimum dose, the duration, and the target population. So rigorous clinical trials based around the axioms of evidence-based medicine have left some gaps. So if we want to do rigorous clinical trials, we need another approach, particularly if we're thinking in terms of licensing and marketing authorizations. I suggest we need to draw a distinction between regulatory logic and clinical or evidence-based logic. And clinical logic, for me, is can I use this medicine on this baby at this time when I can see whether the baby's head falls off and medicines can be prepared in pharmacy to meet my needs. And that's looking at specific things. And so the evidence-based medicine level of rigor can help me answer that because I have so many safeguards with my pharmacy and with my direct observation of the patient. On the other hand, the regulators have to say yes or no to companies making claims about a medicine that is given for a specific indication rather than for a particular baby, and that it needs to be manufactured in a form that's high standards and appropriate for this age group. So this general question needs to give us a different perspective on rigorous clinical trials. As John said, clinical trials for industry and sponsors need to be regulatory ready, with good justification of all assumptions. Why use these inclusion criteria? Do they predict the outcome that you're interested in? Do the endpoints measure something that matters to the patient, rather than being what's convenient in clinical practice? And to do this, we need high-quality data. Is all the data correct? And traditionally, people have used 100% source data verification to check whether all the data is correct, although people are now moving towards asking, is all the relevant data correct, with more risk-based monitoring plans. So this approach means that we have to think carefully about the definitions of inclusion criteria and the definitions of endpoints. And what's becoming clear, as John's pointed out, is that many definitions are the same between studies. So we need to share definitions. And that means we need a mechanism to develop shared definitions. Another difference is that regulatory trials are different in the sense there's a pipeline. You start off with a molecule, you think it might be relevant in neonates, you need to get the right dose, get the right formulation, get a small-scale answer before doing the big-scale questions. So each step of the pipeline is based on existing knowledge and aims to fill those gaps explicitly. Each study takes one gap at a time, rather than many neonatal trials which appear to want to solve all the questions at once. And each study is well justified and thinks about the dose and the formulation. And some good examples of this are Dr. Viscardi's work on azithromycin through the written request and that pattern of work, but also the Pediatric Trials Network, that it also works in this way to fill the gaps and meet regulatory standards. But those exemplars are a minority of pediatric and neonatal clinical trials. But many of the justifications are the same between studies, and many definitions and justifications are between the same studies. So either we can work alone or we can share. And I hope that you're beginning to get a feel that we need to share, because INC is the mechanism by which we can begin to share. So what can we share? We can share data, we can share expertise, and we can share resources. We can share data between different stages of development and between programs. So Dr. Viscardi was kind enough to share her PK data with a European program that's working in a similar space to develop azithromycin. You can share it within the stages of development. You need to have your data on the preclinical and the animals that's able to be shared through bridging or extrapolation with the human studies. And we can share data to come up with expected incidences of adverse events. It's a major problem working out whether something's gone wrong on a newborn baby. Is it due to the drug, or is it because they're a premature baby? And if we know what the background incidence is, then that task becomes easier. All of these roles involve multiple uses of data. And so when you're using the data for multiple purposes, it becomes even more important than usual to make sure the data is reliable and is being collected accurately. If you're going to use the data for multiple purposes and rely on it for more than one medicine, then you need to have common definitions, and the medicine needs to be accessible, collected in the same way, and interoperable when it comes to queries. And the various efforts going on to meet these needs, one to highlight is the work on common definitions that has been led out of NICHD, and there are now registers of definitions extending into neonates, which are globally relevant. Another source of data sharing is within studies, which need to be consistent between countries and continents. So there are very few neonatal conditions that can have a full drug development pipeline in one country, even a country as great and good as the United States of America. There are some conditions which will need global collaboration, and certainly the pharmaceutical industry want to have one integrated program rather than having to register a drug in America, in Europe, in Japan, in Australia. If it can be done with one combined program of data, then everyone's going to get the new medicines more quickly, particularly the babies. So if you're going to work within studies and across multiple drugs, as John said, we need shared protocols, master protocols, agreed protocol elements, consistent standards of care, and shared placebo groups. And I might even aspire to the standards that cancer are setting, whereby early phase studies are done as a comparison of multiple studies, multiple drugs with a single placebo group. And that might make things like seizure treatment much more ready for development. We can also share expertise and resources. Clinical research networks provide shared working arrangements which lend themselves to establishing regulatory quality and data sharing with common contact points, reusable infrastructures, and international links. And just as one exemplar, which may be relevant to the Pediatric Trials Consortium that John's mentioned, here's an example of England, where in 2010 it took nearly 4 months to get a study open in UK centres, whereas now it takes less than 1 month. And so by working together, we can speed up trial delivery. We can also speed up the rate of target attainment for completion to recruitment target, again going from 2010, where 1 in 5 studies recruited to time and target in the UK, and now it's 3 in 4 complete to time and target. So the shared resources that John's talking about will make a big impact. There are plenty of opportunities to share. Here are 2 networks which may be relevant to these discussions. In the yellow is INEO, and in the blue is the European Network for Pediatric Research at European Medicines Agency that I co-chair with Irmgard Eichler from the EMA. So you'll notice that there is some green, which of course is the overlap between yellow and blue. And there are many countries that have active research networks, that have active databases that allow us to share data and hopefully begin to share clinical trial protocols. So in summary, I'd like to suggest that it's important to do good trials so that we maximize the likelihood of improving treatments. And good trials are more likely if we share data, expertise, and resources. There are many opportunities to share, and INC, for me, is the most important one in the neonatal sphere. Thank you very much.
Well, now it's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, who's Dr. Ronald Portman, who's Executive Director of the Pediatric Therapeutic Area at Novartis Pharmaceutical Corporation. He's the development lead for the Pediatric Center of Excellence there, and joined pharma after a distinguished career as Professor and Director of Pediatric Nephrology and Hypertension at the University of Texas in Houston. He also serves on the executive committee of the AAP section of Advances in Technology and Therapeutics, and has been a wonderful addition to the International Neonatal Consortium. Dr. Portman.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not sure who you're talking about. But I'm going to talk a little bit from the industry perspective. People who work in industry have the shared dream that John talked about to provide safe and effective medications for children and for neonates. The question is, how do we do that? And really, why haven't we done it so far? So there are a few compounds directly developed for neonates. We've seen surfactant, we've heard about that, and nitric oxide. And when neonatal research was done, was the compound in fact needed in neonatal medicine? And John has already quoted that article. So how do we judge need? Well, for those in industry, if we have developed a drug in adults, we have an obligation to study that drug in pediatrics, and now there's an emphasis that we have to include, unless we have a good justification why not, to include neonates. However, there are a few similarities with adult diseases, except perhaps for the anti-infectives. Have we developed drugs specifically for unique neonatal conditions? And we talked to other members of the INC who are in industry and asked them whether they are doing studies in the neonate, and of course they are when it's related to a drug for which there's a regulatory requirement, but specifically for neonatal indications, uniformly that was not being done. Why would industry develop drugs for neonates primarily? Hopefully because there's a need to do that. But we also have to look at the cost-benefit analysis, which I'll show you in the next couple of slides. They are mostly rare diseases and have an orphan classification if we were to develop those, and there are some advantages there. But we really need new innovative legislation to stimulate neonatal drug research. John has already gone over the various legislations, and I'm sure Diane will also mention them. I only mentioned that on the far left, the Pediatric Research Equity Act is the one that requires us to do these studies, and in Europe, the pediatric regulation requires them as well. So let's look a little bit at some cost analysis. It is very difficult to get a drug approved. If we look at this particular study, we see that we'll look at each phases of drug development and the probability that you'll move from one phase to another, starting off with phase 1 and 2, all the way to an approval of a drug. The important thing to look at here is the fact that if you look from phase 1 all the way to drug approval, you have about 11% of drugs that actually get approved. So it's certainly, there's a lot of investment before you get a drug that can be approved. If we look at the cost of these drugs, the current costs, and this is a relatively recent study, looking at all costs from pre-human and clinical, it's now $2.5 billion to get a drug on the market. So it's an enormous investment. However, we can do this. We have a new construct in pharma over the past decade where we are looking at systems biology first to identify the right pathways, the pathways that might be going awry in human disease. We then look at systems pharmacology for the right target. Once we've found that, we can develop the right molecule through transitional sciences. Once we have the right molecule, then we can see what the right dose should be, and then finally make sure that they're provided for the right patient. And this would include the neonate if the system biology dictates that, and I'm going to give you some examples. First, we're going to talk about a drug that was developed first in pediatrics with potential neonatal use and then moved into adult disease. Then a drug that was developed for adult disease but with a different and specific use for a neonatal condition. Then a drug that was developed for a rare genetic disease with the first in human studies being actually done in infants and when the dose based on animal models. And finally, we'll talk about new neonatal indications being explored and those possibly being driven by new incentives. So this is the first example. The pathway that was identified was an abnormality of increased activation of interleukin-1 beta. This leads to generalized inflammation, and this pathway can be used in a number of different diseases, including gout or CV risk reduction, which did not pan out. Also CAPS, which is the cryopyrin-associated periodic syndromes, and that is mainly a pediatric disease that also bleeds over into the adults. And that was the first ones that were studied for this now approved drug called Ilaris or canakinumab. The CAPS included familial cold autoinflammatory syndrome, Muckle-Wells syndrome, and neonatal onset multisystem inflammatory disease. It has then gone on to systemic JIA and is now being studied in hereditary periodic fevers. So the next example is retinopathy of prematurity. This particular drug was initially for an adult indication of macular degeneration, but now it is being studied in the neonate for ROP. As you can see, this is a huge global problem with almost 20,000 patients per year having severe visual impairment or blindness. There are 2 companies at the moment that have drugs that are looking at different pathways for treatment of ROP or prevention of ROP. Shire is looking at IGF-1 replacement early in the process before ROP actually occurs, and our company Novartis is actually looking for at the treatment of ROP with an anti-VEGF compound to treat this. There are a lot of challenges for doing this. Looking at the dose selection of our compound, ranibizumab, in the Rainbow study, we have to balance the efficacy versus safety, producing a high enough concentration in the vitreous because it's an intravitreal injection, but knowing that neonates are really leaky, there is going to be some that's going to get into the systemic circuit, and we need to have a low enough dose to avoid toxicity. The final example is spinal muscular atrophy, which was a first-in-child approach. This is an autosomal recessive disorder. That's the most common genetic cause of infant death. The pathogenesis is the functional loss of the SMN1 gene, which produces an SMN protein, which is key to motor neuron survival. And what we're focusing on is type 1, which occurs in 0 to 6 month olds, and these children never sit, and in fact don't live longer than 2 years of age. We hope that it will be a drug that, if it's shown to be effective, will stimulate neonatal screening so that we can actually make this diagnosis in the neonatal period and start therapy even sooner. So one of the things that we can do, I think, to promote companies to look more at developing drugs for the neonates is shown here in a bill that is before the United States Senate right now, S2041, promoting life-saving therapies for neonates. This bill would grant the FDA the authority to offer an incentive to innovators who develop a new chemical entity specifically to address diseases of the neonate. If this were done, a 1-year transferable exclusivity voucher, or called a wildcard exclusivity, would be available to the company to apply to any of its compounds. The incentive really has a high reward, but it has a high bar as well. The active ingredient may never have been used for another indication. The indication would need to be included on a priority list of critical needs for the neonate. The substance cannot be required to be studied by any other mechanism like PRIA, and it would have to be approved after the date of enactment. This priority list of critical needs would be developed through a public process. the voucher would be granted upon approval of the NBA and BLA. So in other words, it's not just that you do the study, it's actually that the drug would have to be approved by the normal FDA processes in order to get the reward. So this is something I think all companies would tell you that they would be very interested, and it would really drive or stimulate neonatal innovation. This is a possible priority list that we put together looking at clintrials.gov. It's just our own thoughts as we thought about, what drugs do we want to develop at our company that might be able to be used in the neonate, and it includes these various areas. The ones in bold are the ones that we thought perhaps the most important: BPD, persistent pulmonary hypertension, sepsis, ROP, which we're already doing, NEC, and then a whole number of neurological conditions. So in summary, industry has an obligation to develop drugs in the neonate and young infant population in partnership with you and with our regulatory colleagues, but the focus should be on opportunities to accomplish studies and need. Currently, most drugs are being studied in the neonate are either off-patent drugs or drugs that have been developed for adults or older children, which is not really what we want. Honestly, there's very little incentive currently for industry to develop drugs solely for this population, but we can do it. We have the early decision and portfolio analysis which can get this done. Initiatives such as the Senate bill I mentioned could be essential to stimulate this interest, and initiatives such as INC and the Global Clinical Trials Networks could provide the tools to accomplish neonatal drug development. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Our next speaker is Dr. Diane Murphy. Dr. Murphy is the director of the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics in the Office of the Commissioner at the FDA. She is a board-certified pediatrician with an infectious disease subspecialty who practiced in academic medicine for over 20 years before leaving her tenured position to come to the FDA. She has received several awards, including the American Academy of Pediatrics Excellence in Public Service Award in 2013 for her work in making sure that drugs were developed for children and now for neonates. So,
Thank you all for coming, because it's been a long road. And it's been since 1997 for the U.S. that we started on this road, and a lot has been accomplished. But we're here today at this meeting because we still have a lot more to do. We have picked the easy pickings, as they say, and we're down to the populations that are the least like adults. That means we have to develop the science, because we can't extrapolate. In many of these pediatric rare diseases and neonates, we cannot just say we know enough about the pathophysiology of how it's different or the same as adults, and therefore we can just do the dose and safety. And that's a really important concept about why this is so difficult. It's because we have to not only construct or build some of the science, we had to build the databases, we have to build the networks to do this. And you've heard a lot about why that's so important, because you just cannot, in this type of population, with the limited children or neonates that be available, with the limited resources, and with the lack of development that we've seen, you can't be taking up and down, setting up and down networks. It's got to be a global network, and it's got to be a network that we're all participating in and involving. Or we're going to be back here, or you guys are going to be back here in 10 years, and you're going to be talking about this topic again. Let's see. I don't have any conflicts of interest, and the opinion here is just my own and cannot be ascribed to FDA. I mentioned the success. Over 600 products have now been studied in children and labeled. Now, you heard the numbers about those that have been studied in neonates, and why were so few of them really used in neonates. And there are some peculiarities the way this law works. When it was slugging its way through Congress, because there were a lot of people who didn't want this to go through, you had to basically have an incentive program. And that incentive program, we said we would make the requirement and the incentive work together. So if they are developing a product in adults and there is a potential public health benefit for children, including neonates, then we not only can require, but we are also going to potentially, or I won't say always, because sometimes we won't, issue what's called a written request so they could get this exclusivity. And that means there are going to be products that aren't really being used that much. Is there a potential? Yes. But it's a way of providing the sponsors some reward, because unlike Europe, U.S. requirements do not have a reward attached to them. They do in Europe, but not in the U.S. So that's why we have to use our exclusivity incentives. And of these 600, I think it's less than 40, have been studied in neonates. And so we are really at the point where we have to all pull together to figure out how to solve this problem and get it done. And I think that one of the reasons we've really been interested in coming to talk to you all as academic researchers, as clinicians, is that we can't do it without your participation in these networks. This is just a quick summary of where the legislation has not worked well. Again, this is my opinion. The sponsors are required to do studies for the indication that occurs in both adults and pediatrics in the U.S. So you can see already, much of the neonatal population, specific diseases are not going to make it here. And the sponsors are required to do studies for the condition that occurs in both adults and pediatrics at the EMA, or our European colleagues. And so, again, you can see what the issue is. However, our European colleagues do have a little bit of a benefit above us in that they had a court basically declare, and I think I may have it on here somewhere, yes, that they can use a medical definition of condition. And so if it's pneumonia, it's pneumonia. Well, with FDA, you can have nosocomial acquired pneumonia, you can have community-acquired pneumonia. That's the indication. So we have a bit more of a restriction on our requirement than they do. And that's why, again, we keep trying to use our written requests and our exclusivity to try to make it work. But again, it's voluntary. The incentive is totally voluntary. If a sponsor doesn't want to do it, there's nothing that we can do about it. They can just say no. So again, you're having a selection process of what's going to get done under this approach. Again, it's been said, the EMA's exclusivity is tied to its requirement. And that works in some ways well for them, and other ways, if they have something that's really unique or is limited to the neonate, they're going to have a harder time getting it than we will, because at least we can try to get it with our exclusivity program. The other issue we have here is that orphan products are not exempt in the European legislation, and they are in the U.S. So anything that occurs in less than 200,000 patients, we can't require. And so that, again, gets us back into these small populations where we don't have people don't like to call it stick in a carrot, but we don't have any requirement to be able to get some of these studies done. Some of the things that have been positive about the legislation on both sides has been the transparency. And it's mandated that these studies, or when they are studied under either BPC or PRE in the United States, that the reviews by the FDA medical officers, statisticians, and pharmacologists go up on the web. And so that data is available, and negative study data is available. If it's an adult study, it's commercial confidential and you can't learn about it. But because of the lack of studies in children and the difficulty in getting those studies done, all this data is available, even the failed trials, which I think is a great place to begin to learn what didn't work. And so we do have that positive part. The negative is, of course, we're not publishing the patient-level data usually. Now, there is an exception to that in that when we can't get off-patent products or our written request has been declined, even for an on-patent product by a sponsor, we can send it to NIH. and they have a priority list, and they can, if this product is on the NIH list and they decide to contract it out and the studies get done and we get the data in, that data will come in a way that you can get down to some of the patient data and actually usable data. And ANSI-Check at NICHD has really been working hard, because right now, the way they have to send it in by the law is called the docket. And guess what? That's a Word document type thing. So trying to get that into a searchable database is what they're trying to figure out how we're going to do that. And again, many people don't know where to go to find some of this data, and it's on the OPT, Office of Pediatric Therapeutics website at FDA. So we have a listing of all these products and the trials. Long-term safety is another area that we've been talking about a lot recently, and certainly for neonates it gets really complicated. But as you all know, trials are small, they're short, and we really don't have any real resolution to how to do really good long-term safety assessments. And we've had a recent meeting on this, and we're going to have more meetings on this, when we're going to have to, again, utilize all the databases we can find. We're going to have the networks involved. We're going to have registries. We're going to have history study. Everybody's going to have to be involved in this if we're going to get any relevant, really useful data out of long-term looks, if you will, with products that are being taken chronically by children. So you heard how it's hard to get these studies done, how small groups of patients are involved, and that's why we have to have global studies. And we consider pediatric trials as really precious data. And we need to find a way of doing it so that we don't have the issues with the trials being set up and taken down, and no constant, if you will, level of quality control, level of knowing what the data, where it's coming from, how it's being handled, et cetera. And we need this, particularly in neonatology. So we are harmonizing globally. And for some of you who've been to the talk we had yesterday, we had our European colleagues on the WebEx, and we talked about how we meet every month, and we look at the studies that have been submitted to them versus us. And because of the way their legislation is written, sponsors are going to them now before they come to us. So they're actually helping set up the trial design before they come to the U.S., which is not a good thing, and we're encouraging people to try to think about coming to both. And certainly for serious and life-threatening diseases, we've always said at the agency, it was in our previous rule, we're always interested in looking at serious and looking early at studies for serious and life-threatening diseases. The other thing that the Europeans have is they can't file, the companies can't file their adult studies until they've met with the pediatric committee and get an idea what might be wanted or desired. And so, again, that is driving a lot of what is happening. And why we need to all be interconnected in this approach. Or you as an academician are going to end up with a trial that was decided in Europe, and I can tell you from our cluster meetings now that we've been doing since 2007, we resolve over 73, I think, between 70 and 75% of the differences, but there are cultural differences. There are differences in what some people think should be studied. I'll give you asthma as an example. We didn't resolve the fact that looking at waivers, the U.S. thinks a combination product for asthma would impact compliance, and we wanted it studied, and the Europeans didn't. So there are going to always be some differences, and that's why we need to find out what those are as early as possible. Let's see if I can think of it. And it's not just the EMA. As you've seen, the Japanese, the Canadians, and the Australians are also on these calls. As I've told the other audience, there are no lawyers. Well, they are, but they're not. They're in the periphery. This is mainly set up for the scientists. So one agency or the other says, hey, we've got this proposal here, or we got this issue, or we've got this safety signal, and we want to see what you've got, you know. And so we then identify the experts in our office, or they identify the experts in their pediatric group, and we set up the call every month. And then we talk about at least 4 to 5 products in the morning. And so we can get a really vigorous exchange going. We can figure out whether this is something that we need additional conferences on or working groups, or is this something we can solve pretty quickly by just sending each other the information. So it's really been a great experience, and it's one of the most exciting activities I do at FDA is getting to listen to scientists argue. It's sort of fun because, you know, you learn why people look at things differently. And this is just to give you an idea of the types of things. Whoops, how do I go back here? I want to go back. The types of things we look at. And I thought you might be interested to know that, you know, how extended is going to be what you asked for is the leading area. Safety, big one. And then what is the actual sort of requirement that you're going to have is right here in trial design. So whether we're going to ask for neonates or we're going to ask for some other rare disease, all of that are some of the things that we discuss. So I'm going to get towards the end here and say that pediatric trials are global, and we, meaning the regulators, the sponsors, the investigators, the academicians, the parents, the patients, we need this. We need global pediatric networks. We aren't going to move forward very well or very rapidly without them. We need to maximize the experience and information that we learned from every patient in every neonatal trial. And we need to share the data in a timely way. We recently had an experience where NIH wanted to come in and bring some data to us because it was on that list of products that weren't getting studied, otherwise old product. One of the researchers, well known, and you've heard this, refused to give them the data. I mean, this is just really, we can't move forward if people approach product development research in that way. And we need to invest in the science to further define some of these endpoints. One of our problems with pulmonary arterial hypertension right now is we don't have a good endpoint to measure that the agency can accept. We've tried, and catheterization was too high risk, and we really know that we have to get that endpoint developed before we can move forward in this area. And as I've mentioned, we need mechanisms to track long-term safety. This is the website that I hope you learn to go to. This is the new pediatric, every drug that's over 600 that have been labeled. Here's the safety reporting activities. And down here, oops, I can't make it go down, but at the very bottom, you see that medical, statistical, and pharmacology reviews. That was the first line. The next line is from 2012 on. Now, Jonathan, you know, in The Wizard of Oz, I'm sure some people think that the FDA is the Tin Man, isn't the one with no heart? Okay? But we like to tell you that we not only have a brain, we have a heart, and we really want to work with you in moving this area forward. So thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ralph Bax, who is trained in neonatal neurology in Munich. He built and led the Department of Developmental and Neonatal Neurology there before joining the pediatric team at the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, the European counterpart of the FDA, in 2007. He is the scientific officer and pediatric coordinator of Pediatric Medicines and Product Development Scientific Support Department at the EMA. So, Dr. Bax.
Thanks a lot, dear colleagues, and I would like to thank also John and all the organizers for inviting me to speak to you here. It's really an honor and very much appreciated to show you a little bit the European point of view, European efforts to accelerate neonatal drug development. And then I was asked to tell you who else we should include. And hearing all these presentations, I mean, everybody seems to really be very well included already, but perhaps we might have a couple of few ideas. And yes, Jonathan, you just mentioned regulators are being kept busy. I mean, that is not the point of our legislations. As you can imagine, we like being busy, but the point is with all our busyness, we really need to have a even better outcome specifically for neonates. So my disclaimer, I also have no conflict of interest, and as Diane, I'm speaking on my own behalf or not of anybody else's. And I would just like to remind you a little bit of Europe. Here you find, it looks a little bit different on this slide, but it shows already that we are quite used to having to cooperate a lot. So you find in Europe about 50 regulatory authorities, and the whole system is set up as a network, of which the European Medicines Agency is sort of a hub and meeting point. And here are some facts: 28 member states, as you know, 24 official languages. And I had to also include here in this official slide from our agency the neonate, and I will complain next week that this should be officially also included. I don't want to bore you about any authorization procedures in Europe, but this shows a little bit. Diana has been speaking about cultural differences, and you see on the right-hand side the pattern, and this pattern obviously will also reflect different standards of care, also in neonatology. As we all know, this standard of care might be different across the road. So we face in Europe quite a variation of standard of care, and that is also reflected in trial design. So we have examples where a trial design had to be adapted to different standard of cares. For example, countries not having access to brain cooling. For this situation, a certain medicinal product had to undergo different trial design, obviously. Diane also has mentioned the legislative approach, how societies have decided to put more emphasis on the development of pediatric medicines, and also Mark Turner has actually listed these essential points: high quality ethical research. So I don't have to repeat all this. And at the same time, it is not just pushing for as many trials as possible, but also to avoid unnecessary studies, and obviously also not to hinder development for other age groups. I would like to, this legislation obviously encounters many aspects. So not just the pediatric investigation plan, on which I will speak a little bit more, but also, as we have heard, transparency issues, development of networks, and Mark has, for example, mentioned the network of networks, which is established also at the European Medicines Agency, trying to combine and give a platform for all the different networks across pediatrics. If I now speak a little bit about this pediatric investigation plan, basically it's a plan a sponsor or an academics consortium has to provide to show how they intend to develop a pediatric medicine covering quality, safety, efficacy. And we have had a look into the numbers a little bit concerning neonates. So looking at about over 700 development programs, it is quite consistent across the years that about a quarter of them contain neonates. And if we look at these neonatal programs themselves, about most of them obviously include term neonates and 37% preterm neonates. 2/3 of these neonatal programs are actually proposed by the applicant, and 1/3 has been requested by PDCO and EMA. That also shows that while the PDCO, learning from obviously coming second after the FDA with such a pediatric legislation, they could learn and quite pressed, I must say, and put a lot of emphasis on developing clinical trials also for neonates. But that doesn't mean that this is done obviously for every product. As you can see, of those development programs, 75% do not include neonates, and there can be different reasons for not including them, being safety, being, for example, the condition not occurring in these age groups. And if we look a little bit more into the therapeutic areas, you see that over 50% of development programs contain neonates in the cardiovascular space and hematology, hemostasiology. And at the other end, below 10%, it's dermatology, immunology, and vaccines. And we always have to remember, it is not a regulator determining the priorities and determining the needs. It is completely dependent on what regulators receive as applications. And pointing out to the therapeutic areas, actually neurology, for example, is one of the areas where the PDSO has pushing hardest for trials also in neonates. Here's just, we have seen all these prioritized areas, and that is just an overview of PIPs covering these areas. And here you also see for ROP the product Ron has been speaking about previously. So you see these areas are covered. There are plans containing only neonates, and there are plans, as you see on the right-hand side here, containing neonates and also older age groups. There are also in other areas, such as pain and nutrition, also programs only containing neonates and also mixed programs. And when we look in at the numbers planned to be included in clinical trials in a trial database, we can see since the implementation that children increased, the inclusion of children in clinical trials increased about threefold to over 400,000, whereas neonates, there we could observe a 20-fold increase to over 15,000 planned to being included and recruited in clinical trials. But as Diane has mentioned, it is about what we put into these plans. And that is why we have to speak and to collaborate, in my opinion, much more, because our goal is better medicines authorized for neonates and not a high number of pediatric investigation plans or a high number of numbers of neonates being integrated in a clinical trial database. So collaboration and interactions are already ongoing a lot. It's my main task is actually really to interact and collaborate and speak. But I have the feeling it is more collaboration within silos. So regulators speak to regulators, which is very important, as we just have heard. I mean, it is really important to harmonize as far as possible, speaking to health authorities and also working with WHO. We have meetings all the time with industry and sponsors. We do meet on conferences with academia, with nurses, clinicians, and we also include and strive to include more and more patients and parents also in discussions at, for example, the pediatric committee. It will be a little bit difficult with neonates, but we have their parents and carers who can provide a significant insight. However, this cross-connection is, in my opinion, not sufficient yet. And this is why I'm so enthusiastic about what is going on at the moment. Here's my famous complexity slide. Whom else should we include? I do think formulation, for example, has been mentioned and is important in our discussions. We are having discussions not about just which excipients to use or not to use, but whether to use new forms, for example, mini tablets down to the area of neonates. And obviously, this is, from our point of view, a very important area. The non-clinical aspects are also included in this consortium, and here we are trying to push also for very important models and what we can learn from juvenile animal studies, whether they could help us in defining also studies in neonates, and also trying to reduce numbers of neonates having to be included in clinical trials. Whom else to include? Next week, we're going to have a discussion at WHO about the initiative of better medicines for children. And here also many activities are ongoing. And in my opinion, we should not forget these countries where you see, this is here a map of estimated preterm birth rates, where you do see in low and middle income countries high rates of prematurity, and who also will need sooner or later our support. We are trying to support the regulatory agencies in learning how to deal with pediatric studies, and obviously going down to neonates is not on the actual agenda at the moment. It's difficult in this space for us here already, but they should not be left out and provide a high number of our population. I would like to thank you very much.
Well, our final speaker, before we have time for some discussion, is Lynn Hudson. Lynn is a neuroscientist who came to CPATH from the NIH, where she directed a neurogenetics lab at NINDS and a policy shop in the office of the NIH director. She now serves as the Chief Science Officer of the Critical Path Institute, also known as CPATH, and is Executive Director of two CPATH consortia, this one, the INC, and the Multiple Sclerosis Outcomes Assessment Consortium. So welcome, Lynn. She's going to tell us about the INC and CPATH and how we're all working together.
Yeah, so thank you for not only organizing this session, but being with us from the outset of this consortium, which would be even in the prenatal phase. So a decade ago, FDA issued the Critical Path Opportunities List to address the scientific challenges underlying the pipeline problem. It was called the pipeline problem because there was a slowdown of therapies reaching patients. The FDA framers of the Critical Path Initiative recognized that not only was there a need for new approaches in specific areas such as pediatrics, but that new models of collaboration were needed. So the Critical Path Institute, also known as CPATH, was formed to respond to many of the challenges identified by the Critical Path Initiative and serves as a neutral, nonprofit, convening scientific consortia of industry, academia, and government to share data and expertise and enable regulatory agencies to directly participate in developing new methods to assess the safety and efficacy of medical products. A visionary neonatologist at Cedar FDA, Dr. Susie McCune, recognized that the challenges of developing safe and effective therapies for the neonatal population are so great that no one single organization could take it on solo. So enter CPATH. The end goal of each of CPATH's 12 consortia is official regulatory endorsement of novel methodologies and drug development tools that are developed by the consortium and then made freely and widely available. Those tools include biomarkers, clinical outcome assessment instruments, clinical trial simulation tools, data standards, and other in vitro tools. And several examples are listed here. The first, imaging biomarkers, one for hippocampal volume for Alzheimer's disease. The second, for another imaging biomarker for total kidney volume for polycystic kidney disease. Before we developed a quantitative disease progression model in polycystic kidney disease in order to support total kidney volume as a prognostic biomarker, there were no controlled clinical trials in PKD. Now, several companies are using this biomarker and testing drugs for this devastating disease. And for Alzheimer's, we know that sponsors are using the clinical trial simulation tool that was developed through our CAMD consortium to aid in designing the right trial for their compound. Sharing data is central to our consortium work. For our multiple sclerosis consortium, we have 15,000 individual patient records from clinical trials that we've standardized and pooled and are now analyzing to come up with a new performance measure that can be used as a primary or a secondary endpoint in clinical trials. This highlights the added value that can be gained by reuse of data beyond the initial data use, which in this case was the clinical trial that was set up to test a specific drug, and the insights that can be gained by pooling data versus doing a meta-analysis of individual studies. Data has to be standardized before it can be aggregated, and we continue to partner with the leading standards development organization for clinical trial data, CDISC, to develop therapeutic area data standards for the diseases and conditions that CPATH consortia target, which have included MS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, TB, and more. And next year, FDA will require the use of CDISC data standards in all submissions to CDER and CBER. So for the Inc. launch, we are now 1 year old with 101 members from 23 countries, and those members represent 6 different stakeholder communities. But as Ralph just indicated, there's parts of this map that we have gaps for that we need to think about addressing. Being global does present time zone challenges, which we address in part by having 2 face-to-face meetings each year, one at the EMA and another at the FDA. Before the consortium even launched, the focus of the consortium on the needs of the neonates, specifically conditions commonly encountered in neonatal medical care, was established at our first annual workshop at the FDA in 2014. So the prevention and treatment of brain, lung, gastrointestinal injuries, sepsis, ROP, and neonatal abstinence syndrome rated on our top 6 conditions, and also we're concerned with drugs to prevent preterm labor. So the prevention and treatment of neonatal abstinence syndrome has received bipartisan support in the passage of the Protecting Our Infants Act of 2015, thanks in part to the educational efforts of John Davis and other neonatologists. Inc. could play a role as the Department of Health and Human Services develops a strategy to address research gaps, and we will be discussing NAS at our upcoming September workshop at EMA. So you just heard John Davis relay the Inc. dream, and you just saw that our Inc. co-directors truly are a dream team. Our Inc. members, whether from industry or academia or patient foundations, contribute to the decision-making body we call the coordinating committee and or different work streams, giving freely of their time and expertise for this shared vision of a healthier world. Presently, Inc. has 2 disease area work groups focused on seizures and bronchopulmonary dysplasia, and 2 cross-cutting work groups, one on clinical pharmacology and the other on data. And I should say that we also have these cross-work group teams. The neonatal nurses have been really prominent in our consortium. They've already played key roles through the National Association of Neonatal Nurses, NAN, and COIN. We've had participation in our work groups and active participation in our deliverables, communications. They've been reaching out to their members to gauge different perceptions of clinical trials. And I would say, just as neonatal nurses work closely with families in the NICU, our nursing members will be working alongside family organizations in Inc. to figure out how to embrace a research culture in the NICU so that our dream of having every newborn admitted to the NICU enroll in a study protocol to optimize outcomes can become a reality. And that is another big topic for our meeting at the EMA in September. So for our first year deliverables, our big deliverable was our ClinPharm white paper, which was drafted at a October workshop and worked on for quite a while to gain consensus, and is now under review at Pediatric Research. We've also contributed, given the vast expertise in Inc., we've contributed comments to different policy documents, including the proposed rulemaking federal policy for the protection of human subjects. In process, our seizure work group is developing a master protocol for treating seizures. Our BPD work group is developing a definition for BPD, and our data work group is developing a guide of normal lab values and ranges. So we continue to explore what other initiatives that the consortium should take on. And at our most recent workshop, we examined retinopathy of prematurity, bacterial infections, and hemodynamic adaptation. So CPATH brings project management to each consortia to drive deliverables. Both the seizures and the BPD work group had their face-to-face workshop in March for a deep dive discussion, and we expect the drafting for both groups to take place through the summer with several rounds of review and finalization in the fall. At our March workshop at the FDA, expert panels laid out the state of the art for ROP infections and hemodynamic adaptation and discussed what particular projects are most needed to move the needle in that area. Then the audience voted on priorities. In the next few months, these individual projects, such as those for infections, which we're developing a standard protocol or a method to assess efficacy of treatment, will be scoped out, and the coordinating committee will decide based on priorities and available resources which projects to move ahead with. Our recent publications show how we collaborate to focus on the needs of the neonate and the rationale for the specific projects undertaken. So all of Inc.'s deliverables will be broadly disseminated through the literature, through contact and submissions to regulatory agencies, and by posting on the Inc. website. Getting the journals used to recognizing Inc. as the last author in the authorship lineup has been one of those culture changes as we do more and more what's called research by consortium. So finally, at CPATH, we specialize in turning competitors into collaborators in order to de-risk decisions in drug development. In launching Inc., we discovered that the neonatal community is already fairly collaborative. The issue was more that there are 1,000 flowers blooming, yet we don't know which conditions produce the best blooms. So our job is to help align efforts around the globe, where possible, achieve consensus or harmonization, and develop standardized methods of collecting data and designing clinical trials that can be applied throughout the world. Thank you.